Hello and welcome everybody from near and far to this webinar, Division 52, International Psychology. This webinar is part of an ongoing series to celebrate activities of psychologists around the world to provide useful information for international engagement and to encourage us all to take a broad and global perspective. My name is Dr. Karen Brown, and I, along with Dr. Falu Rami, are your co-hosts for today. Before we begin, our online audience has the ability to ask questions by typing them into the chat box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to type your questions and comments during the presentation, and we will be making a note of them, organizing them, and during the last 10 to 12 minutes or so, we will present them to our speaker for discussion. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Rami as she introduces our guest speaker.
Good morning, everybody. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome our speaker for this morning, Danilo Guimarães, and this webinar is also organized by Dr. Tateo and Dr. Marcico. Dr. Danilo is Associate Professor at the Institute of Psychology, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. He's been working with theoretical and methodological issues of psychology, semiotic cultural constructivism, history and philosophy of psychology, indigenous psychology. From his previous work emerged the notion of dialogical multiplication to understand how people construct diverse meanings of their affective experiences in the world with the others. It articulates selected philosophical notions of alterity and intersubjectivity, the anthropological theory of Amerindian perspectivism, and dialogical approaches from contemporary cultural psychology. He founded in 2012 the Amerindian Support Network with people from Amerindian communities in Sao Paulo, Brazil, aiming at organizing a series of meetings between the indigenous and the academic communities in order to identify the psychosocial vulnerabilities they face and elaborating possible strategies to overcome some persistent threatening impacts of the colonial processes. From the reflection on these issues, he published the book Dialogical Multiplication Principles for an Indigenous Psychology in Latin American Voices series. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the mic to our speaker this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Falu. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Luca and Pina, for inviting me to this speech. I would like to, the title of my speech is Psychology and Indigenous People, Frontiers and Barriers. I'd like to show you some guidelines I have to this presentation. Let me see, how can I do it? Share screen. Well, I hope you are you can see my guidelines here. I will start talking a little bit about COVID-19 and how it impacts indigenous people, because this speech is part of the pandemic series. So we have some numbers here: 5,000 indigenous peoples in the world, 305 indigenous people in Brazil, 276 indigenous spoken languages in Brazil. So it's hard to talk about how indigenous people in Brazil are facing COVID-19, because we have many different realities of indigenous communities and people. And so, and the country is very large, so it's impossible to know in general how it's happening. Nevertheless, we have a website from the social environmental organization. That's this link, COVID-19 socioambiental.org, where you can see many information about many data they collect in different communities. But in general, we know that the government neglects the indigenous, there is a government neglectation of the indigenous tragedy. We show in this website, you can see some information that shows how the Brazilian state was not only silent, is not only silent, but also helped the virus to spread. 3 cases were the most common: health professionals who took the virus to villages, gold miners, and land grabbers who increased invasion during the pandemic, and indigenous people who were contaminated when seeking emergency assistance in the city. So it's I think I suggest you to take a look in this website. They have some translation also, so it's possible to see and to read some reports in English. But I don't want to only focus on COVID-19 because for us, for the indigenous people, we live in a pandemic coloniality since the invasion of our lands 500 years ago. So this pandemic coloniality is reflected in this situation where we have 476 million indigenous people worldwide, over 19 countries. They are 6% of the global population, 15% of the extreme poor. The life expectancy is up to 20 years lower. It's the legacy of inequality and exclusion, and the vulnerabilities to the pandemic are exacerbated. So it's some general information about how coloniality impacts indigenous life. And here we have some information about the 400 years from the 19th century to the, from the 16th century to the 19th century. We have 19 to 96% of the indigenous population exterminated. In Mexico, 20 millions, USA, 18 millions, Andean countries, 10 millions, in Brazil, 4 millions. Numbers produced by military troops, sickness, hunger, forced labor, corporal punishment under slavery, forced displacement show inhospitable place. In Brazil, until the 90s, it was believed that the disappearance of indigenous people would be inevitable. According to the census, now we have this population, almost a million self-declared indigenous people in Brazil. Around 40% live in the cities. So yeah, this stereotype of indigenous people in the forest is not, it's not valid anymore. Then I would like to talk about the most surprising encounter in European history. According to Tzvetan Todorov, the Bulgarian-French historian and philosopher, in his book about the conquest of Americas, The Question of the Other. It was published in the 1982. He says that the invasion of Americas is the most surprising, produced the most surprising meeting in the European history. The feeling of a radical feeling of being a foreigner, or I don't know how to say that, the feeling of a difference of the other, and a sort of a discomfortable, uncomfortable feeling, or disquieting feeling concerning this meeting different people. It was the biggest, the largest genocide in the history of the humanity, human history. So it was a very extreme meeting. that has a paradigmatic value. It founds our present identity as modern humans. So modernity started in the same year Colon crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And for Tzvetan Todorov, we all are descendants, direct descendants of this this navigation of the Christopher Columbus. No? This encounter founded the new identity of European peoples, giving rise to the modern age and to the planet-level understanding of the world. Nevertheless, Colon refused the existence of a human substance that was different from his humanity. And he started to identify his own values and his own cultural values as the universal. So under the conviction that the world is only one. So this is for Tzvetan Todorov, an instance, a paradigmatic situation that is present until nowadays. So we talk about coloniality to talk about this idea that we are all descendants of a large-scale colonialist process. And the indigenous people from the land now called Americas transformed the existential, political, and epistemological basis for modern humans, and placing us in the face of persistent impasse to the present day. We are all together, Homo sapiens and other beings. The extermination of the other ends up as the extermination of oneself. And Tzvetan Todorov also talks about the similarities and differences between the people in the centuries of the conquest, of the invasion, and now, and we, as we proceed today. So he claims that history is a sort of, it's an example that makes us to reflect about ourselves, and the knowledge about ourselves depends on the knowledge we construct about the other. So this is the reflection of a historian, but we also have a reflection of the indigenous shamans about this history. Ailton Krenak is a Brazilian indigenous, very respectable and respected indigenous leader. And he talks that this meeting, the recent history of the last 500 years, is a time that's repeating itself every day. So our encounters, they happen every day and will continue happening. And it always leaves the possibility of recognizing the other, of recognizing in the cultural richness and diversity of our peoples, the true heritage. So the idea is that the colonization continues happening nowadays. And it continues reproducing a point of view that supposes the other inferior to us. And it desensitizes and ends up compromising with extermination. So even if you are not killing people now very explicitly, or if someone claims that I don't have anything to do with this situation because I'm not doing that, if we are not sensible to the situation, we end up compromising with the extermination that's going on until nowadays. So we have, I tried to produce a very short map of contemporary impacts of colonization addressing being. but now reflecting some differences. For instance, reversing this idea of indigenous people as inferior that's present until nowadays. For instance, in economy, about 16% of current world food supply originated in North America, indigenous people from North America. Concerning gender issues, indigenous people accepted 6 gender styles in their traditional culture. So gender issues, economy and gender issues that are impact us nowadays, discussions that are very present today. And it talks for me that indigenous people has a knowledge and a culture that we're very more open concerning gender issues and also economy. In politics, Iroquois Confederacy influenced in the democratic societies. The notions of justice, liberté, égalité, fraternité are also based, partially based at least, in the way of living of the indigenous communities. Participatory democracy against totalitarianism, the idea of communal land against private property, all ideas that are present and are influenced by indigenous way of living, influences arts, science, will, volition, desire, sexuality, spirituality, medicine and health, and so on. Traditional indigenous territories coincide with 80% of the planet biodiversity. However, the difference between scientific and indigenous worldviews continue to create barriers to meaningful collaboration, and thus the widespread assumption that science is superior to other knowledge systems. So that's the point. Sometimes we just ignore the contribution of these people to the contemporary knowledge, even in scientific knowledge. We have many shamanic prophecies that are related with COVID-19. Indigenous people claims that white people think that they can use only science to reduce the damage caused by them. We Guarani do not believe that the environmental problems will be solved only with Juruá science. Juruá is the people with beard. Usually they use this word to talk about white people. Shamanism, the reflection of an anthropologist about shamanism, Els Lagru, she talks that it serves to discover the action of invisible agents and counter effects. There is the acute conscience that every predation triggers counter predation. So it's a principle of shamanic understanding. And here we have also Davi Kopenawa, a very important shaman, saying that no one is dreaming of what will happen. The sky will only fall when there is no more indigenous, when there is no more forest, more river, more indigenous people. Without the indigenous, without the forest, the world will fall. So there are some prophecies, and the indigenous people associate these reflections, these shamanic reflections, to the experience we have about a world that damaging the environment and the consequence of these damages. So I would like to talk about the frontiers and barriers between the scientific and shamanic systems of knowledge, and how psychology can dialogue with this shamanic way of understanding. what are the possible contributions of psychology in the border of indigenous messages, including their ways of living and the cultural traditions that constructed the science of psyche, mind, and behavior. So how a dialogue is possible or it's not possible. We avoid resembling the coloniality, although we can never be sure that by not behaving like the colonizers, we are precisely not being similar to them, accepting colonial violence to new circumstances. So we need to reflect on ourselves to observe how scientific approaches produce epistemic violence. And I'm discussing now dichotomies that reproduce coloniality through epistemic violence, that are obstacles to the goal of achieving a collaborative path between psychologists and indigenous people. So this opposition between superior thinking and inferior thinking, the opposition, the dichotomy, logos, myth, rationality, science, shamanism. And I take the notion of barrier from Ernest Bush, the cultural psychologist, that he defines a barrier as an area that is difficult to overcome and may need particular interposed actions for the passage. Once barrier crossed, however, the action can proceed more or less as before. A frontier, in contrast, marks the separation between two areas of behavior, which requires an area-specific adaptation in the form and direction of action taken by the individual. So psychology can relate with the indigenous people as and take the challenges as barriers, or take this challenge as frontiers. I'm trying to identify the barriers in the relation between psychology and the indigenous. We have linguistic barriers. We have time-space barriers because it's not easy sometimes to reach the communities. We have extra-verbal barriers because it's necessary to adapt ourselves to new environmental conditions, social routines, and meanings. We need to face the suspicion the indigenous do not trust only science and the scientists as contributing to crucial issues to their communities and the contemporary world. And also the indigenous asks for the implication of the scientist. They need to check the level of implication with coloniality, its threatening impacts to humanity and the environment. And we developed a sort of procedure in order to face these barriers based on regular availability to listen each other, to get familiar to each other, and to construct shared objects of interest. When we talk about psychology and indigenous people as frontiers, we face a different issue. Overcoming some barriers, the psychologist without consequences for psychological knowledge, for instance, once once the barrier is crossed, however, the action can proceed more or less as before. Once data is collected, theories and analytic categories are processed in the laboratory, far from the community. So that's the limitation of a work or a relation with the indigenous people as barrier. So if we cross the barrier and we apply theories and analytic categories to the data we could collect or construct after crossing the barrier. Nevertheless, we have a different idea when constructing knowledge in dialogue with indigenous people. Our idea is based on demands theoretical and methodological innovation, and we consider this approach the specificity of indigenous psychologies, that is to transform theoretical and methodologies. The aim is to transform theoretical and theories and methodologies, psychological theories and methodologies, in the dialogue with indigenous understanding. So we need to create an area-specific adaptation, a border where this adaptation can happen. It's not the same as only treat them as a barrier to collect or construct data. The idea is to transform our theories and methodologies through dialogue. Then I'm passing to the final considerations here. But before, maybe I have time to talk about these two attitudes we can have as researchers, dealing with the difference of the other, the different understanding the other present to us about the phenomena we are interested in. The dogmatic attitude of the researcher prevents the criticism to the theoretical and methodological boxes. It refuses the other conceptions and procedures about the topics of knowledge approached. For instance, a researcher refusing the shamanic understanding. So the shamans are only relevant to give us the data. The analysis and the meaning are produced by the researcher. The real or the deep meaning are produced by the psychologist, disqualifying the other as inferior or unnecessary to science, or only necessary as to produce, to deliver the data. On the other side, we have the eclectic attitude that also prevents the subject from the contact with the different by disqualifying the difference itself, as if the understanding of the other, indigenous or shamanic, could be easily translated into the scientific knowledge, values, and beliefs. It could be an idea that, okay, we put all together, it's possible to make a direct dialogue without any problematization of the shamanism and of the scientific theory, as if the dialogue could be easy and or complementary, or without any problem for or any disquieting feelings for the self and the other in the interaction. So these attitudes, the dogmatic and the eclectic, are we identify them as problems in this frontier between psychology and indigenous people. Well, coming to the final considerations here, the indigenous psychology against pandemic coloniality. Colonialism produced threatening impacts to indigenous people around the world. These impacts are persistent. Coloniality is pandemic. It creates limitations for human life in the global. It's foundational for modernity, configures nationalities, institutions, arts, and sciences. It hierarchizes inferior and superior thinking, desensitizing the suffering of those who are considered inferior. The hierarchy are correlated to other modern dichotomies, logos and myth, rationality, science, and shamanism. Amerindian shamanism understands pandemics and other problems of modern societies as consequences of the lack of or poverty of ethically oriented reflections and actions of a large portion of human beings over other beings and societies. So we identify the issue in ethical, in the lack of ethical reflections, or not sufficient ethically oriented reflections. we do not acknowledge irrational relativism as a solution, but the rational epistemology, together with the naturalistic ontology grounding in modern sciences, are insufficient to face the relevant issues that impact human life and in the planet. We understand that psychology emerged as a field of knowledge in the border between great dichotomies of modern societies: mind, body, spiritualism, materialism, nomothetic, ideographic, conscience, unconscious, etc. So psychology has an experience because of its particular situation as in the among the sciences. Uh, it it can, with its experience, collaborates to the creation of semiotic devices for communicating differences. So maybe I think that psychology has a lot to contribute in this direction. And indigenous psychology is in the border between persistent coloniality, strengthening indigenous paths of resistance. Methodologically, it learns from the observation through participation, collaborating with indigenous resistance in concrete communities. Theoretically, it reflects the dialogue with shamanic meanings and practices. Indigenous psychology validity is based on the ethical effectiveness of its propositions, addressing duties and effects of human actions in the world with others, a commitment with sheltering varied understandings of well-being that differ among peoples and communities. Well, that's my presentation. I hope you could understand. I'm sorry about my English. There is a lot of time I don't give a conference in English, so my accent is more intense now, I think. But I hope you could understand. If there are some questions, I'm here. I'd like to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danilo, for the brilliant presentation. We have several questions as well as comments, so I'll go ahead and review them and let me know if you need me to repeat them because some of them are a little bit long. Um, so, sorry, my chat disappeared. Um, so the first question is, in what way will post-COVID-19 affect the indigenous people, especially with reference to psychology?
It's affecting in many ways. At least here in Brazil, we have this. I think it's possible to access that social environmental organization website. They have a lot of issues about how COVID-19 is affecting now, and we are producing reflection about how it will affect after we supposedly have the vaccine for this virus, or so on. But we have different levels of this affectation. For instance, many indigenous traditions are based on living together, community houses, and community experiences that we have every day. And now with this idea of social distancing, it creates challenges on how to deal with this kind of necessity of social distancing, isolation, social, to be far from each other and so on. And psychologically speaking, we have many issues concerning here, for instance, um, because for us, we have an understanding that the roots and the myths of a community, if they can live it in a more uh, how to say, if they live in their land in a truthful way, if they can if we can live our roots and myths, usually the communities that are able to keep their traditions, they are able to deal better with what we call psychological issues. So if these reads are if they don't have stability in their cultural practices, it creates a lot of challenges at a psychological level. I don't know if it answers the questions, but
No, thank you. I think that was a wonderful explanation. So I have a comment and then a question from our next attendee. Thank you very much, Danilo, for your great presentation. Decoloniality could be a pathway to build a bridge between psychology and indigenous claims. I'm thinking that the question is, can
uh,
decoloniality be a pathway to build a bridge between psychology and indigenous claims?
um, I think it is a path, a very important one. There are some sociologists working in this, uh, using this concept of producing and constructing this concept to face indigenous issues, contemporary indigenous issues that are consequences of colonization. Uh, so I think it's a very important path in this trajectory, in the construction of the bridge between psychology and indigenous claims. Uh, Nevertheless, I'm convinced that uh, the most important is to be together with the indigenous people, to be uh, side by side together with them, and talking to people in the communities, understanding their way of living. There is an indigenous leader that worked with us for some years before, and he used to say, to deal with indigenous issues is different of dealing with indigenous persons or concrete persons, you know? So what I see sometimes is that many people discuss these issues theoretically, uh, but they don't have the experience, the concrete experience. And the concrete experience gives us many uh, ideas to reflect that are relevant. So all those theoretical, the theories of the notion of decoloniality is very important, yes, but it's important to put it into action together with the people, I think.
Thank you. The next question is, how do the indigenous populations see the current pandemic, understanding that they consider colonialism as being a pandemic as well?
Well, our communities are very used to um, this kind of situation that now is pandemic, it's global, but we have after the invasion of the Europeans to the Americas, I put some data there showing how many people were killed. 19% of the population died after the invasion in the first 400 years of the invasion. And the diseases were one of the main causes of these deaths. So what we see is that COVID-19 is only one more pandemic situation we are facing. And of course, we need to take care, but the communities and the indigenous reflection is that it's one more consequence of this um, colonial, of this coloniality, that the how colonialism continues nowadays. Uh, yeah, I think that's the idea. That's how I see indigenous people talking about COVID-19 in many different spaces.
Thank you, Danilo. Um, the next one is a comment, and there's multiple questions. So please let me know if you need me to repeat them. I'll go through the whole thing um, the first time. Thanks a lot for the wonderful talk, Danilo. Following your reasoning, isn't any psychology indigenous? From the epistemological point of view, the concepts you discussed should apply to any diversity encounter. Do you assume homogeneity of psychology versus diversity of indigenous psychology? Could not be the same way of reasoning also, for instance, North American psychology versus other parts of the world, such as different Mediterranean, Asian, Pacific, etc. psychologies?
Yeah, I'm assuming that our psychologists are based on cultural traditions, uh, but they can be indigenous. I'm trying to differentiate the notion of indigenous psychology uh, in relation to the non-indigenous psychologies, uh, based on one very important aspect, that is the colonialism, the colonial attitude of this theoretical, or of some approaches of psychology. So we identify that some approaches in the psychological uh, field of diversities, some approaches are trying um, to assume or to reflect the universal without considering the diversity. I think the universal can only be achieved through uh, consideration of this diverse paths of understanding about human life with the others, and the diversity of realities we live in. Some psychologists ignores this, so they try to silence the understanding of the other and impose a very particular understanding about human phenomena. And we see it in how, for instance, when psychology go to the indigenous communities and try to overlap some theoretical conceptions or some procedures, psychological procedures, uh, silencing the understandings of the communities, and creating more conflict in the end, because it's not actually a dialogue between difference, but it's the imposition of one perspective over the other. So if psychology is doing that, I think they are not indigenous psychology, because the indigenous is the understanding of this diversity. Indigenous is a name, a very simple word to talk about. Only in Brazil, in the time of the invasion, more than 1,000 different people with different ways of speaking, ways of living, different reads different myths and so on. So 1,000 of different people only here. So indigenous doesn't, this word doesn't represent, doesn't indicate the way of one or other people, but this diversity. So indigenous psychology for me is the psychology that's based on this diversity and creates a platform for a dialogue between differences and not imposing one theoretical approach or methodology over all human realities.
Thank you. That was a wonderful explanation. The next one is a question as well as a comment. Your presentation was wonderful. I am especially interested in indigenous methodology. Can you elaborate a little on that as to how it differs from the Western ideas and why it is not accepted as a valid methodology in academia?
I'm not sure if it's not accepted. I think we are constructing the acceptance of this way of construct knowledge. For me, the reason that it's not accepted is only because we don't have indigenous people in the academy. You know, if the academy were open to the indigenous to come and to discuss ideas and to produce theories and methodologies, then it could take part in the scientific field. Uh, but maybe of course we have the history of science is the history of colonization. It's together, so there is a resistance in this process, the resistance of the uh, in the sense of how can we overcome the colonialism present in the scientific theories. So we are, some people become attached, affectively attached with some theories and with some ideas, and they are not able to uh, to question these ideas. I tried to talk about that when I was talking about dogmatism. So it's a sort of a way of relating with theories and methodologies that protects a lot it against criticism or different point of views. So indigenous, the methodology we are developing here, because I cannot talk about all indigenous methodologies. I can talk about the indigenous methodology I'm developing here, because I know there are many different approaches and also different ideas about what indigenous psychology is, different from what I presented to you. I'm presenting my version, so it's good to say. Um, but our work is based on this principle of dealing with indigenous issues is different of dealing with indigenous people. So we need to live to experience the reality with the other, and after this experience construct meanings, construct a shared understanding about what relevant to study and what is relevant to do in this study. Of course, doing that, we are communicating the indigenous world with the academic world. So it's not abandoning the university, abandoning the academy to live as to live the life of the indigenous, because then we lose a part, relevant, an important part of this dialogue. So to keep the dialogical situation through experience, producing shared experiences. and a platform, a way, a field for dialogical possibilities.
Thank you. The next question we have is, what kind of programs exist to help Indigenous peoples with meeting basic needs?
Here in Brazil, after COVID-19, for instance, we as I told you, the Brazilian state was not prepared to support the indigenous communities, and sometimes creating more threatening, more challenges for them. So many communities started to make uh, to create a network, or not to create, because they have the communities have a network of supporters they work with. So they try to deal with all these people in order to have access to basic issues as food, or the condition to go to healthy unity if they need, and so on. So we have now, for instance, we work with 8 communities here in São Paulo state, and we faced a lot of issues about that. Some communities didn't get food sometimes because they were used to produce some artifacts to sell, and they could buy some food, or they could many lands here we don't have animals, the forest is not uh, enough to supply them. We have a lot of projects concerning the reforestation and to the maintenance of the forest in order to, and also the production of food production through indigenous way of producing that. But we face a lot of challenges, mainly with the communities that are close to the cities and they don't have access to the forest, to a big forest where they could get all the supply they need. And we have to create networks for having these basic issues. And sometimes we take our each of us are available to give someone something, to give to help with something we have, it's like beggars, it's very sad, the situation, because we need to take we need to ask, actually, for friends, help me please.
Thank you, Danilo. Your presentation has generated a lot of great dialogue, and there's a lot of questions still. And I realize that we're coming close to the end of our webinar. So what I'm going to do is I'll read a couple of the comments and then try to see if I can pick a brief question for you. Okay. So one of the comments is, your presentation was very clear and powerful. The resonance with indigenous cultures around the world is strong. Labeling coloniality as a persistent pandemic is especially well argued. Thank you, Nandita from India. The other comment is, sorry, I'm trying to go through all these questions. Congratulations for your brilliant work, Danilo. Thanks for your creative and original research. Your work is resistance and it's very relevant for Brazil and for every country that has to fight colonialism. And then another comment, thank you very much for your presentation, Danilo. So let me try to pick a question that hopefully can be answered in a couple of minutes. Let's see. How can we create generality within diversity, respecting diversity, or we give up from generality?
I think it's possible to create generality within diversity, and I think that's the challenge of of psychology now, and of the indigenous psychology at least, is we have some general principles, and at the same time we are open to the diversity of semiotic elaborations we find in the communities. So yeah, I think that's a big issue, but necessary. It's not, the idea is not irrational relativism. I tried to say in my presentation. The solution is not to fall into an irrational relativism in which all positions are equivalent or possible. I try to explain or to say that the ethical reflection should be the guidance in order to create this generality, because the ethical reflection, I'm not talking about ethics as moral or as rules, but I'm talking about the ethical reflection that's based on how can we reflect about living together with the diversity. There is a notion from Guarani people, but not only Guarani, different people, indigenous people, use this notion of it can be translated into English in well-being. We call it tecoporã. That's about that. The indigenous people reflection about how to live together with the differences, not only in the sense of cultural differences, but also the environmental differences. We have here in Brazil the most diverse forest in the world, and the indigenous people claimed that they created the forest. They created the forest diverse as it is because diversity is the principle for the well-being. It's how to live within the diversity. Nature is not understood here as something that's out there, but it's something, it's the place where we live in with the other beings, other people, other human beings, and other beings that are not human. And this reflection is very sophisticated in indigenous Amerindian shamanism.
Thank you so much. With that, we're gonna need to wrap up our webinar. Thank you so much, Danilo, for doing a webinar for Division 52. It was a wonderful webinar, and really appreciate all the dialogue. And thanks to all of you for participating. We would love to hear from you in the audience about this webinar. Please provide feedback on your experience about both the content and format of today's discussion. If you registered for APA approved CE, you will receive and must complete that Qualtrics hosted online survey. Please check your spam box if you do not see the Qualtrics survey in your inbox. Remember, your CE certificate will be automatically and instantaneously generated and emailed to you. On behalf of the Division 52 Webinar Committee, enjoy the rest of your day and the upcoming weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.